Hey everyone. So this is just a really quick sort of down and dirty video about this project that we have going on, the CLC project that you guys are working on currently. For those of you who are unfamiliar with what I'm talking about, it was the first assignment that we put off for a little bit, and here it is. So you guys are hopefully going to work together. My in-person classes, we've already discussed this. If you're online, you have the option of getting in groups with people in the class. We have our Discord if you want to use that to sort of get to know people. But you have to stay in your online section because that's just how our online sections work. So just be sure that they're in your online section if you're online. Otherwise, if you're in person, um, go ahead and do it with the groups that we've already talked about. If you haven't been put in a group, we should probably discuss that during office hours next week. But here's the goal. We want you guys to understand, how, number one, that inherent to all of our science are these processes, and that we think of processes as vital tools to understand what we're getting at. And so what we wanted you guys to do is look for these processes and try and figure out exactly what you want to say. Like, what did you notice about how these processes operate? And so with that, there's options. You guys can do whatever you sort of see fit with that. But the idea is in your presentations, which should be a PowerPoint if you're online, and be sure that you use the speaker's notes at the bottom for whatever you would say if you were speaking, because that's how I'll read it. If you're in person, again, we've already talked about it. You have a little bit more options and latitude because you'll actually be presenting it to me. So, what are you doing? Well, you should start with, hey, here's my argument. That should be the title of your presentation, the title of your PowerPoint, the title of whatever you're making me. This is my argument. And from there, you should give me, a few sentences, a slide about what did you do to this data in order to get that result, and then show me the results. And so I'm going to show you here now how to play with data. Um, Generally speaking, and again, if you're in my in-person classes, we've had this discussion at length. If not, this might be the first time you're hearing this, but we want you guys to start noticing that when you do a good scientific study, you come in with a question ready to be answered. What you may have noticed from the 109 assignments last semester or from this assignment this semester is it's a lot harder to answer a question if you don't even know what that question is. We dealt with that in my class a little bit last semester in 109, and a lot of you had that issue. Some of you did not because you went into it with a question. That's great. But that's not how all science works. There's a lot of really basic science that relies on not knowing an answer, not knowing even what the question is, just knowing that something is going on and wanting to look for an answer. And so that's where we turn to what we call these big exploratory studies, right? Nobody's really studied the processes inherent to academics before or how it all works or any of that. And so we don't really have a whole lot of understanding of what processes belong in which fields or how things shake out or how popular these are. We do have some understanding of the order in which they are presented, with meta-analyses being last and exploratory studies like this being first. And you're trained to do that when you go into academics, so that's not really super important to you. But the other side of that is when you have all this data, what do you do? And so what I'd like for you guys to notice is that this data at first is a lot. I mean, there's over 100 responses, 128. You have, 4 or 5 different data points. So it's a lot. And so you have to start looking at, well, what do I want to look at here? As a researcher, you may have specific questions. You could, for example, do a whole study on just who answered this first. Who was the first responses? And you could build me a whole historiograph about which answers got responded when. You could do a whole historiograph about the popularity of these fields for the assignment that we did last semester. You could do, a lot with just that information without even reorganizing, without even reordering it or any of that. But let's say none of that interests you. Well, then we can actually reorganize this information. If you know me well, you know that I am huge about the idea that organization is inherent to argumentation. And so if we want this data to argue something to us, if we were looking for an argument in it, we should reorganize this data. And so the first step I would do is I'd actually clean it. And by cleaning it, I mean we should go through and look to see whether or not these things match what we want. For example, this one we know doesn't match what we want. Why? Because it's 5 different fields, 5 different studies. So this person, and it's fine, answered all 5 of those responses in one form, which is not how the form was designed. And so this has implications on our study. Now we should clean it up, which means if we really wanted to do this, then we would go back and actually look up each of these, at least their abstracts, and make sure they're the study we did, give them their own cell, and clean up the data that way. Because right now this data point is a confound in our study. It does not meet the requirements. We have to clean it up. There's a few others in here. For example, um, there's one in here that had a weird, oh, it might be at the bottom. Some of these are missing the field, which means we'd have to put in a field. So you have to go through and sort of do some of these things. These ones are missing processes, for example. We know they're in forensic science, but we don't know what they're doing. And so we'd have to answer that question. And so these are some of the things we'd want to do is we'd want to go back and fix this data so it meets our needs, and then we can reorganize it. If you know, for example, that you're going into psychology and you just want to know the processes inherent to psychology, that's totally fine. Go ahead and pull out the psychology ones. If you just want to work in biology or medicine in some way, look through the ones that are inherent to medicine. I would not skip out on things like forensic science or psychology because those are inherent to what you do. But the immunology, the surgery, all of these other ones would be very important to you. If you want to do education, then go ahead and pull out the education ones. But notice that that will really severely limit your data, which means that the argument might not be as clear as you wanted. And so that's where we are talking about. This is a lot of data. Um, for some for the sake of getting you guys to know what I'm talking about, so for my dissertation, there were roughly 4 hours of focus groups that I had recorded. And from those 4 hours of focus groups, there was, of course, about, oh, I don't know, 30 pages of transcripts. And from those 30 pages of transcripts, I came out with over 100 responses that I had to code individually for each section. And then each code would then rely on some unit of analysis that I'd go in and be like, this is what I'm looking at here. And so it's not super different from what you're doing. Um, Eventually, when you get to enough data, you actually outsource this to computers. But even in computers, you have to tell the computer what you're looking for, and that's what we call machine learning. So that's what we mean when we are talking about cleaning up this data. It is partially about making sure the data is the right kind of data, making sure it's the right authors, the right articles, and all that. And the second thing we really would like is for that data to be meaningful to us in some way. And again, you have a lot of data here. You could do anything with it that you'd like. But the goal is at the end of that, you give us a presentation about what you did to the data and what that revealed to you. And then you make that interesting in some way, hopefully more than a bar or line graph. We talked a lot last semester and analyzed in great detail the need for more critical and meaningful graphs for analysis. And so try to not use bars and lines, try and use something more meaningful. And if you need any advice for that, you can look up sort of any infographic because for the most part, infographics try and turn graphs into something that's more palatable to general audiences. Of course, if you have questions, come chat with me. We've already talked about due dates. If you're in person, it is due the week that you come to class before its due date. So if you come on Tuesday, you turn it in the Tuesday before the due date and you present that Tuesday in class. If you're online, it is just due on that due date. And if you have questions, Discord, office hours, emails, individual forums. If there's anything else, then great. We'll chat then. Otherwise, I hope this makes much more sense to you, and we'll talk to you guys later.